Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for Zscaler's virtual CXO Summit Summer Series. The new enterprise CXO priorities: protect valuable data, optimize performance, preserve the environment. This is a three-part series, and today we kick off this series with episode 1, reducing the risk and complexity of secure cloud deployment. In a moment, we'll hear from our CXO Perspectives panel, including Graham Ludlow, who's the VP and Chief Information Security Officer of a global hospitality company, and Gregory Simpson, the former SVP and CTO at Synchrony Financial. They'll share their transformation journeys to the cloud and the challenges they had to overcome along the way. Following that, we'll hear from Zscaler's VP of Product Management, Moinul Khan, who deconstructs a real-world data breach, describing its genesis, development, and impact, before providing guidance on best practice prevention and response. In addition, he'll introduce the Zscaler Cloud Protection Suite, demonstrating its cloud security posture management and lateral threat management elimination capabilities, and much more. But first, let's kick off our CXO Perspectives panel. It is my pleasure to introduce my colleague and our moderator today, Rich Campagna, Zscaler's SVP of Cloud Protection. Rich, please take it away.
Great, thank you, and welcome everyone. I, for one, I'm super excited about this panel discussion. You know, I think it's not only is it a timely topic, but we have a couple of fantastic panelists here in Graham and Greg. So let's kick it off. So guys, thank you again for joining. You know, I think that a couple of years back, if we look at, you know, if we were hosting a panel discussion like this, the topic would have been, you know, hey, should we go cloud? And if so, can we do it securely? But times have changed, and pretty rapidly. You know, over the last couple of years, it seems like pretty much every organization on the planet has extended, you know, out to the cloud in some way, shape, or form. And so I think the discussion now is less around whether or not cloud can be secure, but really maybe more about the next phase of the journey for a lot of organizations. So how does this start, right? Typically some initiative inside of an organization, either IT sponsored or not, you know, done out of a business unit. Maybe there's an acquisition with a company that, you know, has a lot of a cloud presence. And you start with sort of a small foundation, typically a single cloud and probably some migration of traditional applications out to the public cloud. But then from there, the next stage of the evolution is really important. And I think two things I observe happening, and I think you guys will agree. One, most organizations now have begun to shift from a single cloud to a multi-cloud type of strategy. That has some impact on risk and security and on the organization overall. And then two, you know, organizations begin to shift from, you know, kind of this lift and shift of traditional VMs out to the cloud, traditional workloads, into use of more cloud native types of services. And that's big as well, because it changes the entire, you know, sort of risk profile of an application. So I think that's, you know, probably where a lot of the folks on the line are kind of sitting right now, where they've begun to make this kind of next stage of evolution in their cloud footprints. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Graham, maybe we'll start with you. You know, you've been through this journey, both aspects of that journey. You know, what's important for other folks that are just kind of making that change to keep in mind?
Yeah, thank you, Rich. You know, it's an intriguing question, because you're absolutely right. There's been a real evolution in companies' adoption of cloud, going from, yeah, am I going to dip my toes into it, or am I going to go into the cloud? Now most companies find that they are in the cloud and multiple clouds. So, you know, I guess you could say we've migrated to the clouds. So now that we're in all these clouds, that does bring some new challenges. Being in one cloud environment is difficult. It's difficult from a talent perspective, from a knowledge perspective, from a process integration perspective, but moving into multiple different cloud environments that are each unique. They have their own configurations, they have their own tooling, they have their own capabilities. It brings an extraordinary amount of complexity to an IT organization. And therefore, from a security perspective, to understand that, to know the risks and then manage those risks just gets more difficult. So I think that there's a real challenge that many companies are facing as their businesses, rightfully so, pushing into these new environments to get all the business value that comes with that. But then there's also sort of a rising risk level that goes right along with that. Now, to your second point, Now we're not just talking about cloud data centers, but we're talking about re-platforming core applications into serverless architectures or microservice architectures or platform as a service or whatever you really want to call it. It all amounts to the same thing. These are new systems that the company doesn't necessarily own and deploy. They're just using and consuming them. Again, tremendous business value, but each of those, again, has its own, call it configuration, its own security settings. And with every new thing in your environment, there's a new attack surface. There's a new risk. So companies really have to get their minds wrapped around, how do I use this? How do I secure it? And what do I as an organization need to first get the maximum value out of this, but also minimize the risk of this sort of new architecture adoption?
Gotcha. Excellent. Yeah. I mean, I guess, you know, it's interesting, right? In the data center world, you would have had perhaps one architecture to deal with, right? At least in an ideal state. Here, you know, if you're running AWS, Azure, and GCP, you know, that's 3 different architectures. And not only that, but it's a rapidly evolving target over which you have very little control, right? You know, I think it was, you know, 4 or 5 weeks ago, I saw an announcement from Azure during one of Microsoft's, you know, big sort of virtual customer events, where in a single day, they introduced and made available 250 new features and services, right? And so you look at Azure, they have over 600 services. GCP and AWS, hundreds. I mean, you're talking about thousands of services across just those 3 platforms. You know, Greg, how do you even get a handle on? I mean, presumably developers are going to run out and, you know, they want to use the latest and greatest services to continue the pace of innovation. Is this just an intractable problem? How do you deal with this?
It's not a problem. It's really an opportunity. I think the reality is the cloud is where the innovation in our industry happens. That's where the innovation for technology occurs. And so if you want to be a successful company in the future, you have to go to the cloud because you need to integrate with that environment. You know, all companies are now digital companies. You know, we've seen major industries disrupted by pure internet companies. You look at the, you know, the Ubers of the world and disrupting taxis and so on. You've got whole new industries that are starting up that are purely software-based companies that used to own lots of capital resources. So to be able to plug into that ecosystem, you've got to be in the cloud. You know, for us at Synchrony, it was, you know, we needed to integrate with Google Home. So you got to be on the Google Cloud to do that. We needed Amazon, integrate with Amazon Alexa. You got to be on the Amazon Cloud to do that. We had Office 365. You got to be on the Azure Cloud to do that. So even before you get started, you're already on 3 clouds. And you're just barely getting going. And there my Alexa's answering me. So I think, you know, it's important that you plug in and accept the fact that you're going to be in the cloud in a big way if you're not already. And so you've got to drive toward it, not figure out how to avoid it, but you've got to really engage and leverage it. You know, I, as the CTO of GE prior to my role at Synchrony, we had the lots of legacy data center problem of trying to consolidate, how do you move, lift and shift and move things to the cloud. As we spun off Synchrony and I became the CTO of this standalone entity, we were, you know, starting from scratch. We were like a startup. And so we had the luxury of, we didn't need to, you know, get stuff to the cloud just to put it there. We were able to refactor and rebuild to take advantage of microservices and APIs and cloud native technologies to make us a more nimble shop. So I think it's not a problem. It's a reality people have to embrace.
Yeah, excellent recharacterization there. I mean, absolutely. And so speaking of that, you know, sort of that reality that you're embracing, you know, what you just described is, you know, something that requires a lot of talent, right? And even a couple of the folks, I won't mention the A word, so your home device sitting next to you doesn't go off again. But you know, the Amazons of the world, the Googles of the world, these guys pay big bucks, and they're attracting a lot of, you know, the more, you know, kind of senior cloud talent. It's a competitive environment, and there's not nearly enough cloud and or security professionals to go around. So Greg, I know, you know, when we talked prior to the session here, you had some interesting programs that you put in place. I'd love to hear more about, you know, how you've kind of nurtured and grown and acquired some of that cloud talent that you so desperately need to maintain that pace of innovation.
Yeah, one of the things we did is we launched an emerging technology center. So as a CTO, I sort of championed this initiative to drive a new emerging tech center at a college campus. So we chose U of I, University of Illinois, They have a very strong computer science program, very strong engineering program, and world class. And they also have a research park right next door to the campus. And so they facilitate the ability for you to rent space and then hire students as interns while they're going to class. So we would get students 10 to 20 hours a week. And when I left, we had like 65 interns working in this emerging technology center that we ramped up at unbelievable prices. Everything from PhD candidates, for less than $25 an hour to, undergraduates working 10 or 15 hours. And they were studying Amazon. They were studying how to work in the cloud. And they were studying cloud workloads. They were studying Google GCP. So they were coming in fresh from their class where they were learning about this. And we said, hey, we want you to apply it. We're going to throw you into the fire, let you build stuff, let you work with these technologies. And it was a great pipeline of talent. So we were able to say, hey, let's develop these people. We got a lot of data engineers we hired out of that internship program. So we get them young as sophomores, let them work there part-time year round while they're in class. This is not a traditional like go work with us for the summer, but work while you're in class. It was a great way to get talent and start a pipeline to feed our programs and let them see that a company that they may not have heard of, Synchrony Financial, is doing some really cool work and could engage them in exciting things. They didn't have to go work just for Google or Amazon or Microsoft. They could come work for Synchrony and do really exciting cloud technology.
Great. Yeah, I love that approach to kind of developing this pipeline of new talent as they're, right as they're getting out of school. I think that's fantastic. So, and Graham, on your side, maybe similar question. I know you've worked with some programs where, kind of instilling some collaborative education between your application teams and the InfoSec team. Tell us a little bit more about how that works inside of your organization.
Sure thing. So I'm a big believer in letting people continue to learn, to continue to develop, but also setting up structures within which they can act, because we're all busy, we all have a lot to do, and it's hard to make time for something that might not knock down a few tickets out of your queue or get a project done on time. So in our team, we recognize that everyone on the security team needs to understand cloud. It doesn't matter if you're doing PCI compliance work, if you're a security architect, if you're in operations, if you're a SOC analyst. If you don't really understand these new types of architectures, you're not going to be very effective at your job. So we have been very, I'd say, aggressive maybe in encouraging people to first, we do absolutely provide training to all of our security associates so that they can continue to learn in a formal setting. But I think even more valuable than that, we've been pairing our security team members with other IT team members that are really immersed in these spaces, with our development teams, our DevOps teams, our middleware teams, our infrastructure teams, the ones that are our internal subject matter experts in cloud, so that they can see what they're doing, they can understand what these projects are, and really get hands-on to learn these new types of architecture. Because really, whatever your role is within the company, the cloud architectures are the architectures of the future. And because it touches on every business process, it touches on every security process. So, so setting up that framework has been pretty successful. First of all, employee engagement is great because people love to learn. People love to find new challenges to solve and learn some new things. And because we've expressly given them the time to do this, we invite people to team meetings, we have them attend other team meetings, we set up regular just time for our teams to meet and understand what's going on in your space. Well, I'll tell you what's going on in my space. It's also driven a lot of collaboration between the teams, which is sort of in the philosophy of the DevOps model in any case.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And in fact, the fact that you bring up, the DevOps model, that kind of leads into the next line of questioning I was going to ask. And this is great because we have, former CTO and a CISO here, in some ways opposing forces, dogs and cats, right? Hopefully not. But a lot of what's happening in security now is really all about a lot of what you just described, Graham, which is, InfoSec shifting left, as the marketers tend to put it. And that requires more, sort of collaboration between, the application development teams and the InfoSec teams earlier on in the process, right? So Greg, maybe as sort of, former CTO, maybe I'll send this one over to you first. you know, I'd imagine that this is a good thing, right? I mean, you know, solving security issues early on in the in the process, you know, when a developer is just writing code is far less expensive and probably more secure than doing it after something is in production and having to do a bunch of rework. You know, what's kind of your view on how DevOps is changing the culture inside of organizations and sort of this relationship between InfoSec and the application teams?
I think Graham hit on it already when he talked about how his security team is integrated with all these different teams. It's not like there's a security team and a technology team and a development team. We now have Scrum teams, or you know, that develop solutions, and they're working to 2-week sprints. And there's a security person on the team, and there's an infrastructure person on the team, and there's application developers on the team, and there's business, you know, functional resources on the team, and they got a specific set of goals that they're working to deliver. And so there's none of this, oh, I'm the CISO, I'm going to sit on the sideline and say, no, you know, you can't do that. That just doesn't work if you want to be successful. The CISOs that I work with want to enable. We had a great CISO at Synchrony, and he was very much about enabling the business and also ensuring the security for sure, but doing it in a way that, how do you get to yes? And so it's funny because sometimes we would sort of trade hats. I'd be saying, wait a minute, is that secure enough? And they'd be like, you're the CISO, why are you pushing on it? I thought I was supposed to push those boundaries, you know, and we'd have to sort of go back and forth a little bit. And so it was, you know, it was, the nice thing is when you get those Scrum teams in a DevOps environment where you're really using Agile, it's one team, and you're about a product, and you're trying to deliver this product as one team. And so some of those boundaries start to fall away, and you stop thinking about the information security team, the technology team, the business functional teams, and you start to think about the product and the product team that's developing it. And together you're going to work towards one set of goals. And that's one of the best things about Agile is the cross-functional nature. Tears down some of those siloed walls that we had in the past that used to get in the way of getting things done.
That's a great perspective. So Graham, is that the future where, you know, we have these tightly integrated teams around, you know, product development, application development that includes security as a partner to the application team?
I think you absolutely have to. Security, it's always been important, but it seems like, you know, every month or maybe every quarter, there's a new security event and everyone says, finally, everyone's going to realize how important security is. And I think the truth is it's more incremental than that, but it really is happening. When you look at product security, right? When you look at SolarWinds, I hate to name drop them, but when you look at events like that happening, and companies realize that there are so many threat vectors that if you don't have the fundamentals in place to develop secure systems, whether your product is a piece of software, a piece of machinery, or a great vacation experience, you have to make sure that your customers and your business partners are secure and have that level of trust. Moving to a DevOps model, I like to think of it, I'm almost nostalgic for the days when you had your server admins that maintained a server farm, you had your network guys that made sure the bits and bytes could flow, and then you had your applications guys who would write some code and then compile it, put it on the server and then run it, right? Today, like all of that is code. All of it is coding. You know, the definition of what a programmer or a coder is has changed dramatically in the past 10 or 15 years. So when your infrastructure is code, not just your applications, you really have to adapt your security processes, your security people that we've already discussed, and candidly, your security tools. You know, the old school of, hey, cool, put it into production, we'll do a scan on it, we'll pen test it, and then, you know, it's live. It doesn't work anymore, right? Things move too fast, it's too rapid, it's too iterative. And if you're not embedding security early in those processes, where you're catching security vulnerabilities and risks during the development cycle, then first you're costing your company a lot of money because you have to do a lot of rework. And it's much harder if you find something in a finished product than earlier on where you can fix it. And second, you're hurting velocity. You're going to be slowing things down and not enabling the company to move at the speed that it needs to be competitive. So big opportunity with the new DevOps kind of mentality and approach, but also an opportunity as we've moved more IT into software and into code.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And since you brought it up, you know, regarding SolarWinds, you know, software supply chain is a big thing on the minds for a lot of folks these days. And, you know, depending on the stats that you look at, anywhere from 80 to 90% of software that's shipped these days actually comes from open source, right? Which is astounding to me. What does that mean? What's the impact there on security, and how do you maintain a safe supply chain?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and open source and call them shared libraries, it's also part of your infrastructure stack, right? There's amazing capability that has been developed by an amazing community that has made so many different types of software packages better. But just like SaaS and just like infrastructure as a service, you have to acknowledge that there's some level of control that you don't have over those. Those libraries may be maintained by a third party. Maybe they've been inappropriately modified. Maybe there's bugs. Maybe there's vulnerabilities that haven't been discovered. So as part of your security processes, as you integrate into whether it's DevOps or not, you need to make sure that you're understanding what code base you're using. You have capabilities to assess that code base to make sure that it is secure, it hasn't been tampered with, so that you're not unintentionally passing on vulnerabilities into your own finished product. I have no problem with open source. In fact, I think it's a great thing for society. I just think that businesses need to acknowledge that just as if you were getting source code from a third party developed for you, there has to be a level of governance and rigor around making sure that there's an integrity to that code as well.
Great. And so, Greg, as CTO, obviously, developers, pulling a lot of open source software into the applications being developed. What sort of governance have you seen put on? I mean, what do you tell a developer when they start on their first day? They're coming out of this college program. They're going to start writing some stuff. They're going to pull in some open source. Like, what are the guardrails that you put in place on things like open source to ensure that they're making sound choices?
We make them use internally managed libraries. So we're going to incorporate open source. We're going to bring that open source into our internally managed library. We're going to vet it and make sure the governance is in place, and then we'll make it available. And our developers can only use the libraries that are internally managed. They're not allowed to go out to the internet anywhere they want and just pull down open source code. So we vet it. And the reality is there's a lot of commercial versions of open source code as well that are managed and vetted and patched and maintained. So we tended, as a financial institution, we tended to work towards commercially supported open source components that had a company behind it that was helping make sure all the vetting was in place. And that made it easier for us to manage rather than just letting them do whatever they wanted. So an internal developer may have the ability to go to an internal library. If third-party developers had to come in through sort of a virtual desktop into our environment, so they were tightly controlled as to what they could do in our environment, and so that we could manage those risks. But I did want to say too, before we move on, is I'm happy to test any of Graham's vacation products if he needs any help.
I think we're all anxious to get back to the time where we're vacationing on a regular basis, and it seems like things are improving here, right? So maybe we can all take a post panel vacation somewhere tropical. Okay, great. So let's talk a little bit about Graham. You mentioned a recent event, but things like Colonial Pipeline and just ransomware in general continues to be top of mind, right? Mm-hmm. And I don't think we're going to solve it here, on this panel. But in some ways, since this is mostly around this panel's around this move to cloud and the risks there, in some ways, cloud represents sort of the possibility for a fresh start for security, right? Do we have any thoughts on lessons learned from sort of our legacy environments in the data center that can be applied to cloud to better help thwart this ongoing ransomware plague in the industry?
So I love what Greg said earlier when he said that these aren't risks, these are opportunities. I think that there are some risks, there are some opportunities in this. I think that the opportunity here is we can re-architect our networks, our systems, our IT environments in a way that becomes fundamentally secure. I mean, zero trust is out there. I know it's kind of a marketing term, but it's also very real. It's an approach to information technology that is transformative when it comes to managing security risk. And what I see in these new architectures where you're writing infrastructure as code, great. But if you're building it from scratch, you can build it right from scratch. You can almost escape the sins of the past by building a better future through replatforming. A lot of components of Zero Trust are built into the model: segmentation, separation, API integration instead of putting two servers on the same network and they can talk to each other on all ports and protocols. Huge opportunities to enhance the security of core IT platforms by going to the cloud and by going to these new architectures and platforms. So I see that as a huge opportunity. Now, the risk to go along with that is, now that you've sort of moved your control plane to software, that's also a new attack surface. So as companies move to cloud and to multi-cloud, they have to also consider, how is the cloud itself configured? How is it administered? Who has access to it? Because just like today, ransomware might be, I'm going to encrypt the files on all of your PCs. Ransomware of the future might be, I own your AWS instance, or I own your GCP instance. So there's always some risk of opportunity, but I think for the most part, the opportunity hugely exceeds the risk, because you can control a smaller point in sort of those control and the privileged access management, while you're re-architecting your applications, which hold all of your important information and business assets.
Gotcha.
Yeah, I think the other, you talk a lot about network separation, things like that. I think segregation of duties is also really critical, because you'll read about cloud breaches where some developer left something open. Well, help the developers focus just on development. They shouldn't even have the privileges to be able to leave something open, right? You want a very, very few people that are able to screw things up such that you can have your door left open. And if you give too much power to the developers to say, here, do whatever you want on the cloud, well, then that's when you're going to run into problems, right? So you want to have a very, very tight control over some of those things. But what it means is that the developers can focus all of their attention on developing the best software in the world. And they don't have to worry about the house that it's in. Somebody else is taking care of that. And so I think that segregation of duties and sort of that abstraction layer to say, we're going to abstract the coding from this infrastructure piece, which we're going to extract from this other piece, so that nobody can accidentally leave that file available to the public, because they don't have the privileges to do that. So I think segregation of duties is really critical as well.
Yeah. And just to riff off that a little bit, Greg, it's about also privileges, right? Privileges in these environments. And I think for a long time, and maybe even today, a lot of security teams were behind the curve on that, because you have something that has a million different services and probably 10 million privileges behind the service. And an application developer meaning to do well might say, well, just give me root, give me everything. And that way I can work freely. But that brings with it its own whole levels of risk. But there are new tools, there's new technologies and processes where I think that a security team without a high level of expertise in these can sort of assess that and understand that and secure it. I really do think in the past couple of years, not that tools solve all problems, but I think tooling has gotten a lot better. And I think that there are a lot of options now that weren't available previously, that as long as an organization acknowledges that you need some new processes to carry your security into the cloud, whether it be risk assessments or vulnerability management or configuration management, then the solution is there once you understand the problem. And for many companies, I think that's where they get in trouble with things like S3 buckets. Just lack of visibility, lack of basic knowledge about what's there and how to configure it securely.
Yeah, that's right. Automation helps as well, because humans are going to make mistakes. If you're relying on individuals to manually set things up, sooner or later, they're going to mess it up. And it's not any fault of their own. We're all only human, right? So humans are about 3 sigma. That's not good enough if you're talking about security. So automation can make you much, much more secure, because it ensures that you're doing the right steps exactly the same every time.
Yeah, actually, on that topic, I was in an interesting discussion last week with 2 folks inside of an enterprise that we work with, and the debate was around exactly this, right? Giving developers broader permissions for development environments. But then the topic, the point the other party brought up was that it's automation, right, that really craters that type of approach, right? You want to have the same approach in your dev, your test, your staging, your production, the same environment, and they automate a lot of these, these progressions, And so, you don't want to be finding issues, once you get to production, because you're changing things across these different stages of the process, right? And so, I think that's where a lot of what, Graham, you described with these wide open permissions for developers, that's where a lot of these permissions-based problems start, is that, sure, it's just a development environment, it's not open to the outside world. Well, that stuff gets automated into all the way into production, and now you have a real issue. And even if it doesn't get automated, you're changing things too late in the process, and you're not actually developing and testing with that true mirror image of the architecture you're going to deploy in the cloud. And so all these types of decisions, that we give, more permissions earlier on in these cycles, ends up causing big either security or operational challenges that need to be avoided, right? So, one thing that I hear quite often these days, that automation can be absolutely fantastic, but it can also automate a lot of problems, very quickly across a broad set of environments. So it has to be done carefully, right? And I think that's a big change to, the way a lot of these environments work.
Agreed.
Yeah, absolutely.
Absolutely.
Okay, so let's maybe one more topic before we kick it over to the demo here. A couple of weeks ago, this new presidential directive came out, right? And amongst other things, talks about, for the public sector, of course, espousing zero trust, which, Graham, you talked about, talks about adopting more cloud services as a path towards security. It talks about, shift left, right? And these are all things, directives being forced on a lot of, public sector organizations. Are there, do you guys have any lessons learned out of this for the private sector? Anything that you think, you've seen there that should or should not, be deployed without obviously we don't have to get political here, right? But, just from a technology standpoint, what can we learn from that across the rest of us?
Yeah, I'd say, my view of security is most breaches happen because of basic faults, right? So back to the basics is the first place I always start when I think about security. Is like, we've got to have good authentication. We've got to have segmentation. There's some foundational things you've got to do really, really, really well. And a lot of companies don't do those foundational things really, really well. So talking to them about how to avoid this really complex, rare use case, or getting distracted by the fact that, hey, SolarWinds did this. Okay, SolarWinds was a nation state that, they were probably going to get in to most places if they really wanted to. So, don't get all your resources focused on that one little obscure thing. I always use the house analogy. It's like, okay, there's a little, some of the caulking on that back window is a little bit loose. Let's re-caulk that. Well, the front door is standing wide open. I'm not too worried about the caulking on that back window if the front door is standing. You got to make sure your basics are really solid. If you've done that, and then you can expand. You always want to get better. You can always improve. Go caulk that window by all means, but you got to make sure your basics are well done, because that's where most of your problems occur. And it's things like educating your users. That doesn't seem like a big deal. Well, it's a really big deal, because our users are a big part of our security problems, right? So I think there's a lot of things that we've got to do. So I think as long as the idea is, so it's great to have best practices and say, hey, zero trust is a great thing. Let's all figure out how to do that. But when it starts becoming mandated, well, here's a risk we saw one time somewhere. Let's mandate we all fix that one thing. Well, is that the most important thing for me to be working on right now? Maybe not for my business. I've got this list of risks, and I'm going to do a risk-based analysis. I'm going to work on the things that are greatest risk to my company first. And maybe that thing will fit in, later on. I'll get to that one when it's appropriate based on my business risk.
Okay, that makes sense. So Graham, let me ask you this based on Greg's response. You're at the next board meeting that you need to present to, and some board member raises their hand and says, Graham, how do we avoid becoming the next SolarWinds? I mean, is it you give the answer that Greg just gave, which is here are our priorities on cyber hygiene, basically, or how do you deal with that? Because I know a lot of folks have to message to a board, and I'm sure you get asked about these timely kind of topics: Colonial Pipeline, SolarWinds, whatever, right? So what's the response there?
Yeah, absolutely. So you can't build a house on a shoddy foundation, right? You always need to have your hygiene in place. You need to have those fundamental processes, because otherwise anything else you do isn't going to work. I know growing up, I always got drilled on the basics, like playing basketball, right? Dribbling, passing, and shooting. You can't do anything more advanced until you have those things mastered. So I completely and totally agree there. I think that once you move past that and you identify clearly to your stakeholders, whether it's a board or executive leadership, who is likely to come after us? Because if it's a nation state, yeah, you have to acknowledge it. There's some enemies you just can't defend against, right? If someone flies a bomber over your house and drops a bomb on it, that's not something that your home security system is going to be able to handle. So the good news is those are rare, few and far between. A lot of this ransomware and stuff is more commodity, it's organized crime, and they can be defeated, so to speak. They can be defended against, maybe is a better term, through taking those steps. And I kind of actually smiled when I saw the executive thing, because I'm a big believer in zero trust as a philosophy, as an approach. I think it makes the basics easier to do, which is good for a company. And I think it's just sound security philosophy and principles. Again, I'll stay away from any sort of politics thing, but I'll say one thing that could be really good that comes out of the executive order is we do live in a very commercial environment. And if companies have a commercial reason to increase their security, meaning they need to meet a higher standard to serve their customers, they're going to do it. They're going to invest in security and they're going to have better products. So if the federal government, who spends a lot of money, says you have to achieve higher levels of security than before, that's going to benefit me as a private company too, because likely the same company selling to me sell to the government. And if they have to invest in more security and be more secure, that actually does help my security posture. So I'm hoping that that's an outcome of the order ultimately. Don't know if that's going to happen in effect or not, but I'm an optimist and I always look for the bright side of that. And I think that could have a positive impact on the private sector as well as the public sector.
Gotcha. Excellent. Well, thank you guys. I think it's time to wrap things up and kick it over to our demo. A couple, I think key takeaways for me. One, we had fantastic tips from both of you on acquiring and developing cloud talent. I think that was, that's really fantastic. I think our audience can really take away quite a bit from that. And we talked about security teaming across, not only production, but the whole, development environment. That's certainly something that, is becoming more and more important as time goes on. So I think this is a fantastic discussion. And as Greg called out, maybe we'll all meet up here on a beach somewhere at one of Graham's properties. And Greg, I know you're working on a spy novel, so maybe we can get an advanced copy of that book and we can read it on a Chase lounge somewhere. So thank you both for the time this afternoon. This was fantastic.